Let's get going. Today, we're going to be talking about mapping. And in today's world where gas is super expensive and running your boat is super expensive, you got, $80 to $100,000 bass boat. You're going to, it costs you just to leave the driveway. It costs you at least $100 to $150 just in fuel. And that's not to mention food and launch fees and all that other stuff. Mapping your way to more bass will save you so much time on the water. It'll save you time and it'll save you money. And I learned this back when the internet just barely was getting started. So we actually learned on paper maps and using we had paper maps and we had flashers instead of graphs. LCD graphs just barely came out, and so we had to learn the hard way. And it was very valuable because you had to go with your instinct and your experience and the experience of others that taught me how to do this and that kind of coached me in the right direction. So stop wasting time and money. Learn to map your way to more bass. Here we go. Make sure you're sharing this. This is really important information. So remember, from my last class, there's 3 things that a bass needs. There's 1, the bass must have access to deep water. It may not be in deep water, but the bass must have access to it. It's got to be within about 10 flicks of the tail. And you know how fast a bass can swim. But it's a security issue. The second, bass have to have food. Okay? The third thing is they got to have something that they can relate to. Now, mapping incorporates 2 of those things. It incorporates 1, it incorporates the access to deep water, and then 2, it identifies something that the fish can sit next to. And they mostly use this for ambush. Now, the one difference is they don't necessarily need to sit next to a rock or a tree, or they could be using a shade line. They could be using the bait fish themselves if they're out, cruising out in the middle of the lake. I've experienced lots of times where I'm out in the middle of the lake and all of a sudden you see bass busting all over in the middle of the lake. We're over 100 feet of water. What are they doing out there? I call them pelagic bass. They're acting like tuna fish that have corralled these bait fish up on top, and they're actually relating to the bait fish themselves. I hope that makes sense. So please make sure you're sharing this. We're going to keep going on this. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do, and I'm going to show you a slide here. The first thing that is super, super important. No, that's not the one. There we go. Okay, first thing you've got to do before you even get to the water, and pull out a map. Whether you use Navionics map, now they have Navionics maps. It's super, these are so valuable tools. But having a paper map is actually super beneficial for me. The weeks leading up to whether I'm fishing a tournament or maybe it's a club tournament, maybe it's a big tournament, maybe it's a fun fishing weekend that I want to take my kids on. I'm going to sit there, I'm going to take this map and I'm going to spread it out. I'm going to put it on the wall in my workspace or wherever I'm chilling. If you're in a man cave, set it up in your man cave. Become one with the lake. Look at the lake. You want to get kind of a general layout of the lake. You want to be able to, it's hard to do on a map like this. This will give you all the little details. And I'll tell you what, these are fantastic for little details. But having a paper map, looking to see the overall size of the map, size of the lake, how it's structured, where the water comes in, where the water goes out, kind of which direction the water's flowing. You can tell all of that just by staring at a map of a lake. You can't necessarily do that by surfing the internet. You really have to kind of know what questions to ask. So I call it getting the lay of the land. Get comfortable with kind of what the lake looks like. When you're out there, now we have GPS. You can just kind of go, I want to go here. You can set a waypoint and off you go. And you can start heading that way. It used to be that you had to have a map or you didn't know where you were. That's just the matter of fact. And that's kind of the way I look at it is the more comfortable I am, I can go, okay, I remember this feature, from looking at it on the map. As you're cruising down, you can go, if you're going, say, an up and arm, like example, I was up at fishing the U.S. Open, and I was in the Virgin Basin heading up into Overton Arm, and I could count 1, 2, 3. It was the third cove on the right was the one that I wanted to be in. This is GPS had just barely come out. You were still using Magellan handhold ones. It was different. And so being able to rely on your senses and not always on your electronics is super important. So having a paper map is important, and just get a lay of the land, get a feel for what that lake looks like, and spend some time really looking at it. The second thing, you really want to look at, okay, so now you got the map, kind of the lay of the land, the general, here's what it looks like, here's the way everything's going to flow. Even the directions, or the way it's faced, north, south, east, west. It particularly makes sense in the springtime when you fish those northeast banks, or the northwest banks, sorry. Those are the banks that are going to get the most amount of sunlight. Those are usually your first spawning banks, right? Just be familiar with the lake. So, things you want to look for. The first thing you want to look for is identify creek channels. This is major creek channels. So let me show you on this one first. Okay, so on this one right here, this is a typical topographic map. This happens to come right off of Lowrance Navionics app. This, if you look right here, this is the creek channel. You can see the deeper edges right here and the deeper edges right here. Before they put the dam into this lake, there was a river channel that flowed right through here. Okay, and I've marked it right here so you can see it. Let me get out of your way so you can see this creek channel. This creek channel starts up here in this arm, and this is the major creek channel. What you need to remember about creek channels is creek channels are the Bass's highway. It's like when we get on the freeway and we're cruising down the freeway, there are going to be certain exits that we're going to take off. Some mean I'm going home. Some mean I'm going to get dinner. Some mean I'm going to work. Bass are the same way. This is their home right here. Okay, and there's going to be certain areas where bass are really going to congregate in this river channel. But this is their home. This is where they feel safe. This is a lot of times where nutrients are brought down out of the mountains. Where you have, even if on a big lake, you can have current from a river flowing into the lake. This is the flow of that river. Okay. Things you want to notice on the creek channel, along the creek channel. Now, this creek channel on some of your bodies of water is in 20 feet. This particular lake, it's in like 80 feet or 100 feet. It doesn't matter. All lakes have a creek channel to speak of. There's no lakes that just have a bowl. I mean, when engineers start thinking about, well, where do I put a lake at? They want to have something there to start with, that where water is coming through there. They'll dam it up, and then they'll find a way to fill the lake. And then they usually have a spillway that goes over the top. For instance, I've been doing a lot of work studying Oroville lately. Oroville is part of the chain of lakes in California where water flows from Northern California down through the Central Valley into Southern California. How do they move water? It's fascinating. But they put the dam up in Oroville to be able to make sure that California has water, even during drought seasons. Now, over the last, you've seen there's been a lot of droughts out there. This kind of information, having a dam right there, you start to see lots of different things, but so the water level got really low. But now that it's full, now everyone's enjoying it again. But this is that creek channel, and if you look, Lake Oroville was set up in an area where it would feed the Feather River, and the Feather River feeds into the Sacramento River, and the Sacramento River feeds into the San Joaquin Delta. And the San Joaquin Delta, they can either pump it to Southern California, or they can move it out to the bay, or the water can just flow out to the bay, any excess. Vital information, right? But my point is, there's always a creek channel, no matter what lake you're on, big, small, they all have river channels. And they also have, the other thing you want to identify is you want to be able to identify feeder creeks, okay? And I've actually marked some of these feeder creeks right there. So you got a feeder creek right here. You've got a feeder creek right here. You've got a feeder creek right here. And then there's other areas where it looks like you got an indentation, but a lot of those are actually washes where back before this became a lake, that's where water would, when it would rain or snow, that's where water would wash off the hill and create almost like a ravine type look. Those are called washes. I never really understood washes until I got to Lake Mead. Lake Mead, Lake Mojave, Lake Powell, Lake Havasu, they're full of washes. And they're super important to the ecosystem, and they're important to pay attention to. So identify all the feeder creeks. And I'm going to explain why this is really important in a second here. These, remember, creek channels and feeder creeks are bass fishing they're bass magnets. They're the highways. So you could look at this as being like the freeway, and then this would be like a highway off of that freeway that allows those bass to get up into areas where they can feed. Okay? Important to know and important to pay attention to. It's not that you're always going to be fishing right in that creek channel. Now, you may. I know that there's lakes out there where the lakes are fairly shallow, and this creek channel might only be in 20 feet of water. You may be fishing that exact creek channel, and I guarantee you're going to find fish there. When everybody else is beating the bank, you're going to be finding fish out along that creek channel. These creek channels and these feeder creeks have defined break lines. It's something that the fish can sit next to. They feel safe. They got the depth. One neat thing about feeder creeks, especially in the springtime, is I'll give you an example. I was fishing out at a tournament at Lake Don Pedro one year, and I drew the pro that I drew on the first day. He goes, "Oh, we're going to get wet today." And I go, "What do you mean?" And he goes, "Well, it's pouring rain. It's going to be dumping today." And I'm like, "Yeah, I noticed that." I thought maybe he was teasing me, like because I was the he was going to be spearing waves or something. He didn't spear a single one. But what he taught me was, he said, we're going to be running and gunning all day long. He says, make sure you got your mask, make sure your rain gear's on. We're going to be running. We're going to get wet. I'm like, okay. And I was thinking, well, why are we running and gunning? It's February. Shouldn't we be dragging a worm deep? We got up into these creeks and we started looking for all these little feeder creeks that were feeding into the lake. And we'd pull up, and we would literally start at the end of one arm and start working our way down. And you'd see water coming in. He'd pull up, he'd motor up and check the water temperature. If the water temperature was in the low 40s, he kept going. If the water temperature was in the high 40s, he stopped. And I asked him later, I go, well, what's the difference between these two things? And he says, look, you got water coming in from two sources, right? The main lake water temperature is about 45, 46 degrees. But you have creeks that are snowmelt coming down from the mountains, way up in the mountains. That water's ice cold that's coming into the lake. Those fish are going to kind of steer clear, or if they're there, they're not moving around very much. We're looking for active fish. I brought nothing but plastics. I was planning on dragging all day. It's February. It's wintertime. I was planning on throwing jigs. I was planning on dragging a drop shot. He didn't even pick one up all day long. He threw a spinnerbait and a crankbait and a jerkbait all day long, and we weighed like 13 pounds. But the trick was those warmer creeks that were coming in. He said these warmer creeks are rainwater, not snowmelt. And I went, wait a second. So you got snowmelt creeks over here, rain creeks over here, but the rain is warmer than the snowmelt. And it dawned on me, you have water that is flowing in, and you have it was creating a little bit of a mud line. Those fish could sit right in that mud line in that nice warmer water. Even if it was just a few degrees, it got them moving. It got bait fish moving. It got crawdads moving. It was just enough to have a situation where you have active fish in that area. Mind-blowing. But this is one of those times when I went, I should have mapped this thing before I came. I could have lined up all these creeks well before this tournament, and I could run those on my own. or I could help the pro that I was fishing with and said, well, maybe if we would have, maybe we could go do this and this and this. I know where some more creeks are. We'd still have to check them to see if they were snow melt or rain melt. But the difference was I could have helped instead of just showing up and with my tackle in hand and my box and going, all right, I'm here, ready to fish. I could have done that well before. And it's a lesson that I learned and I pay attention to now. In the late winter, early spring, I make sure I'm looking. This is why, looking for these feeder creeks and then going and checking them out and seeing what which one it is. Battle Baits, thanks for joining me, man. I got something special for you. I want to show you here in just a little bit. Stay tuned, man. Anyway, so the next thing that you want to look for is you really want to look for underwater humps or islands. Okay, islands look like this. Usually, it has a little crest on the top, and it has contour lines around it. And if you can see on this one, the water actually would come like this out of here and flow down here. This is part of a wash, but it's really important to know these islands aren't just islands because it was random how that water moved. There was something around this island that made it so that island was erosion resistant. It's usually rock or it's usually really hard sandstone where the surrounding material is softer and so it washes out and you're left with a beautiful little hump. But you have one here, you have one here, you have one here, you have one here, you have one here. Identify them, okay? The best humps are going to have the ones that are directly related to the creek channel. Now, in this particular case, you do have a creek channel right here that flows down. So if you're going to pick one hump to check out, I would check out this one right here, and I would check out this one right here, and possibly even this one right here, only because of their proximity to the creek channel. Remember, bass are going to be following their highway up, but these are like the, this is like when you pull off on the exit and you see a Taco Bell, a McDonald's, a Wendy's, and you're going, where do I stop and eat? These are all feeding grounds, and they can have different things on them, different attributes. Some may be, just like restaurants, some may be closed, some may be open. It's up to the fish to find them, but it's a good way to look at it. Humps are one of those hidden gems that if you don't look for them, so many people they run to the nearest bank and they go, okay, this looks good. And they see trees sticking out or they see rocks, rock outcroppings, or they'll see something and they start fishing and they're going to catch some. But by you mapping and finding out where these are, you're going to find all these little hidden gems. And sometimes it's a question of especially if you're working a shoreline, and I've used this to my advantage lots of times when I would fish as an amateur. My pro would be working his way down a bank. And I've especially done this on the river. My pro's working his way down a bank, and I know that there's an underwater hump about 30 feet within casting distance outside of here. I could sit there and just take my jig and go, whoosh, out you go. Or I can take a deep diving crankbait if I know it's coming up, and I can start fan casting it as he's working its way down. That way I'm not competing for the same fish, right? I'm doing something different. Same thing if he's sitting there casting towards the shore and he goes right over a hump, guess what? I'm dragging that jig down around that hump or doing a drop shot down around that hump. It's something different. A lot of times they're untapped fishing areas. So look for humps, underwater islands, especially near the creek channel. Now, I wanted to show you one in particular because this is kind of gets to my next point. Your whole purpose of getting the lay of the land, identifying the creek channels, finding the humps, finding points. Here's another thing, finding points. This would be considered a main lake point. This right here would be considered a main lake point. Look at how it's right here at the intersection of two creeks. This would be a prime point to check out. And I've never even been to the lake. I already know that because I got two creeks that come in, I got a highway of water, right? And I've got a long point that goes out between the two of them. I know that I can catch fish here. It's a question of how am I going to catch them? But I know that I can come here and I can catch them. Very important to know. And if you have enough deep water in here, this is something that they can hang on the majority of the year. But now here's another thing, and let me get out of the way a little bit here. Look what's down here on the bottom. You got a really prominent island underwater hump right adjacent to the creek channel. Remember, creek channel, hump. I've just identified this cove as one that I am going to go look at during practice. Okay, my first pull into this area, I'm going to take the boat, I'm going to go in, and I'm going to graph the whole thing. I want to graph this island down here. Let me get out of the way. I'm going to graph this island right here. I'm going to go back and forth, and I'm going to graph this creek channel. I'm going to be looking across this point right here. I'm going to be looking at this point right here. I'm going to be looking at all these little points. And what I'm looking for is, I already know that I've got depth in there, right? Remember the three things that we have to have for bass fishing. You got to have depth. You got to have access to deep water. You got to be able to have something for them to sit next to, which you got a creek channel right here. And you have that island that I just showed you, right? So they can be sitting next to that, whether it's rock. I'm going to be looking for grass. I'm going to be looking for trees. I'm going to be looking for other items in here that are going to hold fish. I know that this cove right here is a prime spot for finding bass. So I'm looking for this. This is what I'm looking at. Okay, where was I? Okay, so remember, especially near the creek channel, super important to have. You got a point right here that's close to these little feeder creeks. You got that underwater island that's close to the creek channel. Important to look at. I'm going to go through this thing without even making a cast. I'm going to go and start looking for food. I'm going to look for, structure or cover, not structure, cover. Then I'm going to be looking at the structure. I'm going to be looking at the points. I'm going to be looking at the islands. I'm going to be looking at the ledges right here. Okay, once I find all that stuff, if I'm happy and I found bait, a lot of times you'll see fish, you'll see what's going on down there. Now I get to stop and fish. Okay, but before I even get on the water, I want to identify at least 5 to 6, 7 areas that I can go look at that have characteristics like this, that I know during different times of the year, I know that I can catch fish here. You can follow this back way up in the springtime where bass can move up here into the back of this arm and spawn. Same thing up in this creek right here. As it goes this way, the bass can move up there and spawn. You got deep water points. You've got bluffs. I love this point right here. It feeds out a long way. Those fish can move up, 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 up. If the weather changes, something happens, they can go right back down into the channel and wait for weather to get more comfortable again. We talked about that. So looking at points, looking at primary points, this would be considered a primary point right here. Actually, this would be the primary point. This would be an extension of that point underneath here. Okay, take a look at this. This would be another point right here. So you got the point sticking out. This is the point that you actually see on the shoreline, right? As you're pulling up. This would be the main point. But if you don't look at the point and don't graph the point, you don't know that it kind of veers in a little bit like this. Here's what I like about this point. This point is kind of a long tapering point. And look how close these contour lines come together over here. This is really, those fish could be right up here on this point right here and just immediately disappear into deep water if something was to happen. If something was to change and the conditions weren't ideal for them to hunt, they have a really easy escape point. So we talked about points, secondary points. We talked about washes. When you have contour lines that are really close together like this, that indicates a steeper drop-off. Really important, especially during the wintertime. Access to the creek channels, access to these deeper water points are really crucial. Looking on the inside turn of points. So let me see if I can move over here a little bit. Okay, so as you can see, this creek right here moves and it actually will bend right in here where you can see where the lines come in really close. Well, those of you that are avid river fishermen, you know that when you have a bend in the river, what do you find? You find a lot of it's where when water's moving through the system, bends in the river is usually where wood is deposited, where you have sediment that's deposited. A lot of times you've got an eddy right there where things, food can wash into. It can be, it's usually you find a structure where you normally wouldn't. You also have a steep drop and you have access to flats on either side. In this case, look, you got a deep edge right here, and you got a little point sticking out right here. You got a point dropping in here, and you also have this hump down here. This is like an ideal situation. I've got everything I need to be able to see kind of what these fish are doing on the lake. And as long as, so now I've already met two of the criteria. I've got access to deep water. I've got something that they can sit next to. Now I just need to find if there's food in there. If there's a ball of shad running through here, or there's a ball of blueback herring running through here, I'm golden. I'm ready to rock and roll. I know that I'm going to be catching fish in here. It's textbook. This is what you call a textbook situation. This area right here will hold fish almost year round as long as you have adequate depth. Okay, so we talked about points. We talked about where deep water gets in close to structure or even up to the shoreline. Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be super deep, but it has to be able to be deep enough so that fish feel safe. We talked about humps and underwater islands. We talked about creek channels and how important they are as bass superhighways. I'm going to take a quick drink of water, but the next thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about man-made items and how important those can be for mapping. Please write down your questions. Feel free to ask at the end. I promise to get to them. I'm actually going to be saving this video and I'm going to be posting it on my YouTube channel. And I want to save this first hour and I'm going to post it on the YouTube channel, and I'll eventually get it onto my website. That way, if you missed it, you'll be able to catch it. But I will answer your questions. Just let's wait till the end. Okay, next item of business, man-made items. This is my favorite part of mapping. Okay, and this is not something that sometimes they're shown on, like these Navionics maps. They're getting really good, and a lot of times, especially if it's when it's a shared map, other fishermen will be able to identify certain things. But there's things that I learned over the years to really look for that most fishermen don't bother to look at. They go, their buddies go to this spot and you'll catch fish. Forget that. I'm talking about getting out to the lake, looking at it for the first time. This is one of the reasons why so many pros, when they go to a completely brand new lake, they dominate because they do their homework on the lake. It's not always somebody giving them information. A lot of times they're doing their homework on the lake. They're doing their mapping. They're looking at topographical maps. They're looking at Google Earth. They're looking for seasonal trends, what's happening on that body of water. And then they're finding their own areas that they can go to, not the local honey holes. Now, most of the time they will find the honey holes because they did their homework. And it's something that the locals have known for years, but these pros they don't stumble onto it. Their homework tells them this is where these fish should be. It's very, very cool. You don't need to get all the information from a local. You can figure it out on your own. And it's actually more valuable because then you're not jaded as to how to fish it. Somebody's not telling you, here, let's throw a spinnerbait over here on this bank. They don't need it. You can fish your strengths the way you like to fish. And I am going to be talking about that a little bit here at the end. But things I like to look for on maps, okay? And not all maps are going to show them. Some will, some won't. Sometimes you got to dig a little bit, and I'm going to give you examples. Things I like to look for. I like to look for roads. Not all lakes are natural lakes that have been there for 200 years before there was roads. Most of the time, somebody built up a dam. There used to be ranches. There used to be old buildings. In some cases, there was old towns that were submerged under a lake. And I got a good example of that. But I like to look for roads. I like to look for bridges over that creek channel. I like to look for train tracks. In this particular lake, there's a ton of train tracks because this was an old mining area. That's something, once you learn about the area, it's like, oh man, it's one of those deals. You can find those little honey holes way out deep. And usually roads are associated with multiple things. Roads will go along the edge of the creek channel. Roads will connect from one homestead to another homestead. Even if it's just a hard packed dirt that was trudged on for 100 years, it's hard pack. Nothing's growing on that. It's all rock and hard clay, and there's a reason why they made that road the way they did. They're Bass highways, and they're, like I said, they're right next to the creek channel, which they usually follow the river, or they'll follow. That's why I look for bridges. So I look for bridges, train tracks. I look to see where the dams are. Sometimes you've got one dam, and then they go, you know what? We made a mistake. We need to make this lake a lot bigger. So they build a bigger dam, and they just leave everything down there. The engineers are notorious for just leaving stuff there, like, just leaving it. We have this lake up here in Oregon that I really like to fish, and it was actually there was train tracks that went right along the edge of this river, and it brought people through. They were on the Oregon Trail. They brought miners in. They brought miners stuff in. Brought goods and services, but they brought these trains in. And when the Corps of Engineers decided that, they said, you know what, we're going to put a lake here, instead of demolishing everything and taking it out, they just left it. There are still train tracks and a concrete hut from the 1940s where it was an actual train, like not a train station, but they call it like a conductor stand, where they have the bridge thing that goes up and, or not the bridge thing, it's it goes up and down. They make sure that the trains, there was a split track up ahead, so they had to stop one train here, let the other train go. I'm like, why would you leave that there? Who knows? But you know what? I catch a lot of good fish off of it. Now, associated with that is also a concrete road that is up above that parallels the tracks and goes up, and it actually gives access to that guard station. Let's call it a guard station. That's a great word for it. So you got a concrete road, and you got railroad tracks, and we know how they build railroad tracks. They build it all up with rock, and they put the tracks on top of it with all those wooden all those wooden I don't know what they call them, but they're long wooden pieces of wood that they put the tracks on so that it's stable. It's going to be rock solid. It's got to support a big train. It's there forever. And bass will use that as it's right next to the river, right next to the train, right next to the creek channel. It's an awesome find. This is important information to know. Before you go, look up the history of the area. What was there before? I've got this one lake. Let's see what it was. Okay, here we go. So, how many of you fished Elephant Butte, New Mexico? I went there and fished in the BASS Invitational at Elephant Butte when they had it. I think it was in 98, 97. It was one of those years. Anyway, they had an Elephant Butte. Well, I'd never been there. I was from California. What the hell am I going to do out there? I wanted to fish professionally. I needed to do my homework. So I started digging into I started looking at the map. I did everything. I opened up the map. I got comfortable with it. I found out that half the lake is fairly shallow and full of really sticky trees. And then down in the south end is more deeper and clearer water. Important information. Then I started looking at maps, and I started looking at, okay, how does that creek channel go up through the lake? It starts up in that shallow end and works its way all the way down to the dam. Well, in my travel, in what I was studying, I found out that there was a town there. And I went, what? There was an actual town that was right along the river. And I forget if it was, it's been a long time, so excuse me if I don't remember exactly all the exact details. But I want to say it was some sort of paper mill or match factory or something. Anyway, it had to do with trees and stuff. Anyway, so they had this town. And I looked up online. Back then I didn't have online, so I actually had to call the city records in Truth or Consequence, New Mexico. So I called the city records and I said, "Hey, is there any way that I could get like an old photo of the town?" And they charged me like, I thought it was like $5, but they sent me a stack of photos of this town, and they actually had a road that led in and out, and you could actually access the road where it went up over the top of where the dam is, but you could actually follow that road all the way down into this little town. Well, they had like 6 concrete buildings, and they had, one of them was a library, one of them was a post office, one of them was like a courthouse. But they all had, they weren't all concrete. Some were brick buildings, some were, there were different types of materials. But they actually had a picture of what the town looked like. And so I'm looking at it, and in the corner, they had GPS coordinates for exactly where the town was. So I went, no way. I took those GPS coordinates. When we got to the lake, what's the first thing I did? I went, drove out. I turned on my Lowrance papergraph. I had a papergraph. I actually had 2 of them. I had one in the front, one in the back, because that was the best that I could get at the time other than a flasher. But this papergraph, you could actually see a visual representation that was permanent. There was no screenshotting anything. You didn't have a snap phone camera that you could take a picture of it. On your LCD display, you could see it, but the papergraph actually showed it. And so what I did was I went right to the GPS coordinates, right where it was, and sure enough, I was able to graph the road as it went down, and they still had foundations of the buildings. And on one of the buildings, you could actually see, it was a hospital. That's what it was. There was an actual brick hospital, and you could actually graph the wall that came up about like 15 feet off the bottom, and it was all crumbled, but you could actually see how that thing was shaped. Boom! I see fish all over it. The town was right along the river. Those fish set up camp in that little town, just like they were little villagers, and it was the coolest thing because I had that whole place to myself for the entire tournament. I could sit there and fish all the way through it. Now, getting those fish to bite was something else. But the fact was, because I did my homework, I was able to actually find a town with a road. And I found all of the buildings. I found the library and the courthouse and the hospital. And there was one other one. I think it was, I can't remember exactly. But I remember there's like 4 buildings, and you could actually graph the foundations of some of the buildings. You could see some of the walls. In fact, during the tournament, I didn't catch it, but my partner did. He dropped a big old 1-ounce spoon down there in 35 feet of water and caught himself a 3-pounder, which should have been mine, but I digress. But the fish were there. That was the point. And I would have never noticed that had I not done my homework and done my mapping. Another thing that I found is, here's another one. If a lot of these lakes were taken over by, or they were bought up by the government and then utilized by the water district for a lake. One of my favorite lakes to fish when I was living in California was a lake called Anderson Lake. Anderson Lake was formed where Coyote Creek flowed through these hills. Well, they dammed up the creek, and they dammed it up really high and then created this lake. Well, they bought all the ranches that were there. There was tons of ranches. There were ponds. There was hardpack where people had cattle. There was foundations of homesteads there. There was areas where there were corrals, fence lines. Let's see. I found underwater ponds where they had like livestock ponds where now they're just depressions. But guess what? It's a deeper spot, an area where you've got maybe a creek running through it, and then right next to it was where they would pump the water from the creek into the pond so they could feed the animals. And then you had a homestead nearby that that was part of that ranch. Fascinating information, and I was able to get on fish that nobody knew about because I was fishing way offshore. I was fishing stuff that you can't see with your own eyes. You got to see it all with your electronics. And I would have never known to look for it had it not been for this mapping and looking at. That particular lake was called Anderson Lake, but it's a very common thing to find all across the country, is finding lakes that never used to be lakes, but looking up the information before it was a lake. And a lot of times you can go to your local water district. You can look up Google Earth. Google Earth has been one of the best tools for doing that type of mapping because you can actually pre-fish before you even get there. Using Google Earth, you can actually look at a lake in different times of water level. So most of our lakes, they bring them down in the fall to make room for winter rains, and then they fill them back up. But it's for irrigation, for everything else, right? Well, you can look on Google Earth, and you can look at it at different times and see rock points. You can see wood. You can see underwater structures, underwater man-made structures. One of the local lakes up here, I did that with. I discovered an underwater bridge piling. So there was a creek that ran down, and I knew that there was a road there at some point. And I don't know what the road was for, but I'd never been there. And my buddy was like, "Hey, why don't you come fishing with me?" Well, I got out there and I was like, "Hey, I read online. I did my homework about this lake, and I found out there's an old bridge. Can we stop and fish it?" And he goes, "Oh, bridge." He says, "I know there's a road over here." And I go, "Yeah, well, there's a road, and where it crosses the old creek channel, there's a bridge." We get down there, and that bridge piling was in about 23 or 24 feet of water. I dragged a jig down there and just started thumping nice quality smallmouth off of that bridge piling. And he never even knew it was there. He knew how to fish the road, but never knew about where that bridge piling was. And it was just really neat to be able to say, "Hey, this is something that I learned." But you can do that when you're doing homework on a new lake. Look for foundations. Look for fence lines. Sometimes bass will just sit there along old wooden fence lines. Sometimes they're metal. They're like little cattle fences, and those fish will follow it right up. So that kind of information can be got or obtained from your local water district. So we're talking about mapping today. We're talking about, getting that lay of the land. We talked about finding creek channels and the feeder creeks. Those are the bass highways. We talked about things that you need to look for in those areas. Here's a shot of that Google map. Here, this is that same cove, what it looks like. And if I wish I would have done a little bit better job, but you can actually see on the Google Maps water running into this creek right here. You don't see it here, or you can see a little bit here, but you can really see it filling in here. That's super valuable information. Not all creeks are running all the time. Knowing that through different photos that there's always water feeding in here. This is probably going to be one of my primary areas that I'm going to fish on this particular lake. You can also look up information on USGS water data. You can look at the water level of lakes, and whether you can see whether it's on the rise or on the fall. It works in rivers too. A lot of times dams will have output of CFS. It tells you a lot of information about where things are. There is so much information to talk about when it comes to mapping. I can't fit it all into one class. So today we're talking mostly about lakes. I'm gonna put together another one, but I'm gonna be mostly talking about rivers. But this one about lakes, find those creek channels, find those points, find the underwater islands and humps, find points, look for secondary points, even sometimes tertiary points. You might find that little sweet spot where it, for some reason it stopped, it stopped the water. And then the other part of that is if you can put that in conjunction with old information about the area, whether it be roads, bridges, train tracks, dams, spillways, building foundations, towns, old towns. It's all valuable information that you can use on your next fishing trip. And then the last thing that you want to look for is determine where the contact points are. Where is that fish going to access the deep, that structure? If you've got areas where you say you pull into an area and you've got contour lines that are really spread out far apart, but there's no access to deep water, there's no sense fishing that super shallow bank. It's almost completely pointless. You might find one rogue fish up there, but day in, day out, finding where that fish is going to move up onto that, even if you're fishing on a flat, if say you have a flat that's a mile wide, the most productive area of that flat is going to be the first probably 100, maybe 150 yards off of that creek channel. No more. If that 150 yards is within sign of the bank, you probably have a chance for those fish to be on the bank. Otherwise, I wouldn't even bother looking on the shoreline. Look outside and don't be afraid to fish offshore stuff. There are so many fishermen that have made their careers on fishing offshore. I'm one of them. I love to fish offshore structure, stuff I can't see. We're out at Potholes in August, and we're fishing underwater sand dunes. And you see the sand dune come up, it drops off, and what creates, so that's one of those rare instances where you don't necessarily have one defined creek channel. There is a creek that runs through there because water pulls out of the dunes out there. And so, but out in front of those dunes, you got kind of a mishmash. But here's the thing. You have two creeks that come together. You got Crab Creek and Winchester that kind of come together into one, and you got fish that sit out adjacent to that deep water creek channel on these sand dunes. Really cool information, but fishing offshore where you're sometimes a quarter mile offshore, they're not even with the longest cast are you ever going to hit shoreline. You've got a wealth of fish and opportunity to catch fish out there. So now, last thing I want to say about this, and then I'll open it up to questions. Once you find how fish are holding on structure, let me get over here. Let me look. There we go. This is the area I wanted to show you. Once I find how these fish are relating to a particular type of structure, more often than not, it can be duplicated all over the lake. So if you have, let's say for instance, you have a cove, and I'll give you a classic example of this. You got a cove like this, okay? You got your deep water point, you got your underwater island over here, you got this deep edge right here, and you got two creeks that run in right here, okay? I found an area like this when I was at Lake Mead, and it was up there in the Overton arm in the Virgin Basin. I had the pattern was called Tree 60-30 is what I called it. You had to have a 30-foot break line inside the cove, and you had to have a 60-foot nubbin that kind of poked in the middle of it. And as long as there was salt cedar trees along the edge of the channel, there was fish there. Every single time. I found this all over the lake. I found at least 10 spots throughout the lake, down in the lower basin, the Virgin Basin, up in Greg's Basin, up around Pierce Ferry. Same thing happened all over the lake. Not every spot had fish, but not every spot held fish, but a lot of times when you had these attributes where you had where an old channel coming in and you had that 60-foot break line, you had the trees along the edge of the channel, they held bait, and the bait drew in the fish. If there wasn't any bait, there wasn't any fish. But usually these held, it had access to deep water. It had something for the fish to sit next to. And when the bait would come in, Guess what? It was on like Donkey Kong. And I could make a milk run of these spots. And I could catch fish in multiple areas throughout the lake by following this type of pattern. So that's my experience with with mapping on a lake. I hope this has been helpful to you. Please take a look at it, and like I said, I'm going to repost this thing again and take a look at this is just basic mapping. This is something you can do from the comfort of your garage. Like I said, I still prefer an actual paper map. But when I want to get in and look at all the little details, you can't go wrong with these Lowrance this Lowrance mapping software. It's something else, and you can do it all from. I actually have this application on my phone, and I could sit there while I'm sitting there nice and warm at home, and while I'm watching TV one night, and I can study the areas that I want to go to and what I want to do and how I want to game plan based on the time of year. And half my homework's already done. I can a lot of times eliminate half the lake without even ever having seen it, just because I'm able to map them. Okay, so one more thing. I'll open it up to questions. I'm going to start talking about the ways that I kind of approach it. But feel free to ask questions. And I'm happy to answer them. I saw several questions pop up. I'm sorry, I can't go back through and see them again. But please make sure you like and follow, and and I'll keep going. I have another 50 minutes, and then I got to run. What app is it called? It's called Navionics, and it's It's from Lowrance, and they have some in-app purchases that you can do, so you can actually have layover maps onto, so you can get this map right here. This type of map is for free, but you can actually have layover maps so that you can see what's on the shoreline. And then when you purchase, I forget, I think it's like $8 a year or something like that. But you can actually raise and lower the water levels in a lake. So if you look up on your USGS website and it shows the water level is 25 feet from full pool, you can lower the water level 25 feet, and then you can get a really accurate depth of exactly what's where. But when I'm going into coves like this, like I said, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to graph it. If I don't see any bait fish, or I don't see any fish at all, I'm gonna turn around and leave. I'm not even gonna stop when these fish should be eating bait fish. If say it's late early winter and those the bass are really keying in on crayfish, then a lot of times I will stop as long as I see activity. I want to see what kind of structure's down there. I want to see that there's fish moving around, that they're schooled up down along these points and stuff like that. Then I'll stop. And a lot of times I'll go in with a crankbait like this, or one of my favorites is one like this, especially if you're not sure of the depth. This is a 6XD. This bait right here is perfect for fishing that, like what I would say 12 to 20 foot range. This one right here covers that 0 to 10 foot range beautifully. So I would take a combination of these two. The other thing I never ever leave home without is I always have a jig. This happens to be a Battle Baits brush bomb. Okay, this happens to be his border craw pattern, but this looks a lot to me like a Louisiana swamp craw. It has very similar colorations. You can pick your own trailer. I happen to like using. Great, thank you, Matt. That's perfect. I'm glad. I'm really grateful that you placed that order. Thank you so much. But this is one of those baits that if I'm fishing a lake that has Louisiana swamp craws in it, I'm going to have that one rigged up.